Well, shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this latest episode of the Leaving Babylon series. Now, the last time we talked about the appointed times, the Moedim, and we gave an overview of the appointed times, and we talked about how they're patterns of the covenant and the plan of Elohim for the restoration of all creation. And they're specifically and intimately tied to the crops and the cycles of time in order to teach us lessons and prepare those of us in covenant for that promised restoration. And the point is that we synchronize these times with the crops as we present the first fruits of the land as well as ourselves as a first fruit. So it's a rehearsal. We're connecting ourselves with the land because the covenant is intimately tied with the land. We know Adam comes from the word Adamah. And so we are intimately connected with this ground, and that's the lesson we're supposed to be learning from the appointed times. But in order to keep them, it requires us to understand how to determine time. And the scriptures clearly provide that the two great lights are for Moedim, again, the appointed times. And these lights are also for telling time, for days, for months, and for years. And now those lights were established on day 4, but this is not the first time that we read about light in creation. These lights are clearly different from the light that was spoken into creation on day 1. And we read about that light in Genesis 1, 3 through 4. It says, Then Elohim said, Let there be light. And there was light. And Elohim saw the light, that it was good. And Elohim divided the light from the darkness. Now, so we have light from the beginning, but we have the sun and the moon, the two great lights, the greater and lesser light being created on day 4. And so Elohim actually spoke this light of day 1 into existence. Then Elohim saw, and in Hebrew we read, et haor. He saw et, the light. And the aleph ta is the et, and it's actually connected with the light, haor, of the first day. So the light of the first day is intimately connected with the Messiah, and it's associated with the Messiah. Now we talked about how Adam and Hava were clothed with light before they were covered with skin. And the whole point of light is that it's visible. Elohim is light, and we're supposed to walk in his light in order to commune with him. And light and dark were separated from the beginning, and we cannot live with the Creator if we walk in darkness. Now, man's light was covered, and we need a renewal in our bodies and a restoration in the relationship between Elohim and man. Now we're provided with lights to point us to these special meetings with the source of all light, Elohim. Now from the beginning, we're given patterns of renewal, and that's what we're going to focus on today, is the renewed covenant. In fact, if we go right back to the beginning, evidence points to the fact that man was actually placed in a renewed earth. For instance, the earth that we read about in Genesis 1:2 was in chaos, and it was covered with water. And we read about that in the text. It says, The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Now the scriptures describe it as without form and void. In Hebrew we read tohu vabohu, literally tohu and bohu. The vav, the va, is an and, it's a connector. Now tohu means desolation, confusion, empty place, without form, nothing, naught, vain, vanity, waste, wilderness, all these concepts. Bohu means empty, void. So we read about the earth in a desolate, empty, wasted condition. And this apparently, though, was not how the earth was originally created. In Isaiah 45:18 we read, For thus says Yahweh, who created the heavens, who is the Elohim who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am Yahuwah, and there is no other. Now, notice the phrase that he did not create in vain. And in Hebrew, we read, lo tohu bara. Literally, not in vain create. Again, in vain is tohu. It's that word that means desolate, confusion, void, a waste, a wilderness. So this passage is saying that Yah did not create the earth in a desolate condition, as we read about in Genesis 1:2. So what we read about beginning at Genesis 1:3 appears to be a renewal when light is restored to the earth. And it appears that there was a past judgment that resulted in the earth actually becoming tohu vabohu. In fact, Jeremiah actually describes that tohu vabohu is the effect of judgment and will be actually the result of a future judgment. In Jeremiah 4:23 we read, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens they had no light. Now this is a future judgment that he's talking about, and the book of Revelation actually describes that process of judgment as well as a renewed heaven and a renewed earth after the judgment that occurs upon this planet. In Revelation 21:1 we read, Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and these actually mean renewed. So I saw a renewed heaven and a renewed earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, also there was no more sea. Now Isaiah also spoke of the renewed heavens and earth. In Isaiah 65:17 we read, For behold, I create renewed heavens and a renewed earth, and the former shall not be remembered or come to mind. So it's not brand new, it's renewed. It's a renewed heavens and earth. And we read Shamayim, Hodashim, Ve'eretz, Hodashah. And in Hebrew, it's the same as we talked about the new moon, which is translated as Hodesh. It actually means a renewal, renewed moon. So Isaiah is talking about how time will continue to be reckoned from one renewed moon to another after the renewed heavens and renewed earth. And in Isaiah 66:23 we read, And it shall come to pass that from one renewed moon to another, and from one Shabbat to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says Yahweh. So we can see all these cycles and renewals built into creation, and we see that as we progress from month to month, it's renewed through the light of the sun shining on the moon as we see the first sliver, and the moon progresses through its phases. So we have two lights for time, the sun and the moon, the greater light and the lesser light, and those lights provide us with a clock, so to speak, to gauge days, months, and years. And that pattern was revealed through the appointed times that were built into the cycles of creation. Time would operate in cycles, as would the lives of men. Mankind would live through cycles of days, months, and years until he actually spans from dust to dust. His seed would continue to pass through these cycles of renewal and on and on and on through the generations of mankind, and we see the patterns of renewal and restoration that will ultimately lead us back to the garden, which are revealed through the appointed times. And we actually see this process lived out through the life of the man named Abram. Abram originated in Babylon. He was uncircumcised when he was given a promise, and by faith he acted on that promise and left Babylon. Now tradition holds that his father was an idolater, and Abram smashed his father's idols and then came out of Babylon. He crossed over. He passed through the waters, and that's where we get the meaning of Eberim, of Hebrews. Hebrew is as Eberim is Hebrews. And then he entered into an eastern blood covenant with Yahweh, and we read about that in Genesis 15:17 through 18. It says, And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On that same day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram. So in this instance, he's told to gather animals and birds and place them, so he actually had 8 pieces, 4 on one side, 4 on the other, and their blood ran in the middle. That is a typical blood covenant, and the parties would then walk through the blood in between those pieces, and essentially that was saying whoever breaks this covenant will be like these filleted sacrifices that are surrounding the covenant and that you're walking through their blood. So essentially, it's a very significant process. It's a very formal process, and it's a very powerful process because the parties are really, it's being instilled how important this covenant situation is, this relationship that's being forged. Now, in this text, Abram was put to sleep. We read about smoke, which is ashan, and burning, esh asher, which means fire. So smoke and fire passed through the pieces. And we can discern from the text and from the scriptures as a whole that this was actually Yeshua, as the smoke and the fire passing through the pieces and through the blood. And this was actually the same fire and smoke that would later lead Yisrael out of Egypt into the promised land, and as they camped through the wilderness. So unlike the normal Middle Eastern blood covenant, both parties did not pass through the pieces. Abram did not pass through the 8 pieces of the sacrificed animals and their blood. Typically, both parties, like I said, would pass through the pieces, symbolizing the penalty for breaking the covenant. Here we have just Yeshua passing through the blood, and that shows that he took upon himself the penalty of death associated with violation of that covenant. He took the penalty for both parties, and this explains why he died. And an interesting thing is that the fire is described, as I said, esh asher, literally happy fire. So it pleased him to pass through. He knew full well what it meant to pass through that covenant. He knew he wasn't going to break the covenant, but I'm quite sure he probably knew that Abraham's descendants would at some point violate the covenant. But he did it happily. He went through this process happily, and that's a real powerful thing. And in fact, it takes us back to the first word that we read in the scriptures, Bereshit. And we've talked about this before, but this one word contains incredible messages. And of course, we have Brit, which means covenant, and in between Brit is the word Esh, which means fire. So Bereshit has fire surrounded by the word for covenant in it. And Yeshua is the fire at the center of that covenant that's revealed in the first word of the scriptures, Bereshit. So we see Yeshua and what he was going to do from the very beginning. Now Yeshua passed through the blood while Abram was placed in a deep sleep. And the word is tardamah in Hebrew. And it's actually the same word used to describe Adam when he was placed into a deep sleep, tardamah, when Hava was taken out of him. So Yahweh was in the process of creating a family to fill his house through this covenant. Now by passing through the pieces and the blood, Yeshua demonstrated that he would pay the price for breaking the covenant. And through this process, Yah made a covenant with Abram, Karat Yahuwah et Abram Brit. Literally, Yahweh cut a covenant with et Abraham. And we see that et again, the Aleph Ta, the Messiah, is intimately connected and intimately a part of this covenant with Abram. And we read in Genesis 15:13 through 14, the actual terms of the covenant. Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions." Now Abram actually later rehearsed that promise. He went to Egypt, where his bride, Sarai, was taken captive by Pharaoh. Pharaoh was plagued, and Abram was delivered from Egypt with great riches, along with Hagar, which literally means Hagar, the stranger. So Abram leaves Egypt with great wealth and possessions with his bride and Hagar, the strangers. Now later we see Abram and Sarai being essentially filled with the Spirit, represented by the hay that was added to their names. Abram became Abraham, that's a hay, and Sarai became Sarah, and her name, they both had a hay added to them. And that hay often symbolizes the breath the Spirit. And so we have a picture of Abram and Sarai actually becoming new creations filled with the Spirit, and then that's when the covenant of circumcision is consummated, and only then, when Abram has been cut, the cut of the circumcision, the cut of the covenant, only then can his seed pass into from him filled with the Spirit to Sarah filled with the Spirit, and then that covenant of the 8th day, when their son is born, can then be fulfilled through him being circumcised on the 8th day. So these are powerful patterns and powerful renewals that we see, and through the union of Abraham and Sarah, the promised son of the covenant would come. Now that promised son would later be offered up by his father on the mountains of Moriah in the region where Jerusalem is now located. And from these patterns we can see that Yah would solve the problem that plagued mankind after the fall in the garden. As the covenant continued through Yisrael, who was the covenant bride, Yah continued the cycles of the patterns and revealed that those patterns were the Moedim, the appointed times. Now they were revealed to Yisrael through Moshe in the Torah, but these patterns existed from the very beginning. And these times were always important times in the restoration process of mankind. Now these times would also act as rehearsals for a future redemption. In fact, they're called Kadosh Mikra, which literally means set apart rehearsals in the Hebrew. So as we rehearse these appointed times, we're actually walking out, acting out, and rehearsing future fulfillments. Now when it was time for Israel to come out of Egypt, after the time that was told to Abram had expired, he protected the firstborn of Yisrael by the blood of the lamb of the Passover. He then delivered Yisrael through the Feast of Unleavened Bread, along with Hagar, the strangers, the mixed multitude, as the scriptures describe them. So again, we see that pattern of Sarai and Abram being fulfilled and taken to the next level. He then guided this assembly of redeemed people to Mount Sinai, where he was going to enter into a marriage covenant. And though he spoke the 10 Commandments, and those words were written on tablets of stone. They were the ketubah, they were the wedding contract. Sadly, Israel soon broke the covenant by committing adultery, which was idolatry with the Egyptian gods, through the golden calf. But through Moshe, Yah allowed for the covenant to be renewed on Yom Kippur. Although now all of Israel could not enter the house of Elohim, only the Levites, who represented the firstborn of Israel. So although the covenant was renewed, Israel would not experience the intimacy originally intended through the marriage. So that was something that was going to have to be renewed at a future time in order to effectively and properly restore that severed relationship. Now, Israel eventually entered into the land, but she was fractured and divided. Through King David, the tribes were ultimately united into one kingdom, but that would only last through his son Shlomo. Because of the sin of Shlomo, the kingdom was divided in two: the northern tribes, called the house of Yisrael, and the southern tribes, called the house of Yehudah. The two kingdoms both fell away from Yah and sinned, and were each punished and exiled separately. Now the prophets promised a day when a son of David would gather the tribes together and once again join the tribes of Yisrael into a united kingdom and back into a restored covenant relationship. Now there's no husband-bride relationship outside of the covenant, and it's important to understand. Through the covenant relationship with Yisrael, Yah made a way for his son to enter into that covenant relationship through Judah and fulfill the patterns of the appointed times. Now we know that he first came on Yom Teruah, day 1 of month 7. At the moment of his birth, the sign that we read about in Revelation 12 was occurring in the heavens over Jerusalem at the sighting of the new moon. So as all of Israel was looking up at the sky, looking for that first sliver, And as they cited it, as shofar sounded throughout the land, Yeshua, the Messiah, the King, was being born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the birthplace of King David, and also Bethlehem, house of bread. So we actually read about that sign in Revelation 12:1. It says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." And that's the sign, the constellation Virgo, also known as the Betula in Hebrew, was actually clothed with the sun, and the first sliver of the new moon was at her feet. Actually, I'm filming this on September 25th, 2017, and we saw a lot of people talking about a sign on September 23rd, 2017. That was not the Revelation 12 sign. The Revelation 12 sign occurred when Yeshua was born. So I know a lot of people were expecting the Messiah to return on September 23rd, 2017, but the problem with that is you couldn't even see that sign. I mean, it was an incredible set of celestial events taking place, but people couldn't see what was actually happening in the sky, and so signs are really meant to be something that we see. So it may have significance, but it didn't occur on Yom Teruah, as did the Revelation 12 sign, which occurred on September 11th, 3 BCE, when Yeshua was born. So anyways, there's people looking and expecting for things to happen that didn't happen, but don't be discouraged. We just have to stay focused on the appointed times and the patterns that those appointed times reveal to us. So while Yeshua walked and taught with the people after his birth, it's important to realize that the house of Yisrael, those northern tribes, were still in exile, although he made it clear that he came for the lost sheep of the house of Yisrael. He specifically made that statement. So he was walking amongst the tribe of Judah, teaching and preaching, but he made it clear that he was coming for the house of Israel. So that's one reason why many Jews don't accept Yeshua as the Messiah, because he didn't reunite the kingdom. But he had, first things first, he came as the suffering servant Messiah who would die to shed his blood and pay the penalty for the broken covenant. And at a later date, he will come as the victorious Messiah, son of David, and come and reunite those tribes. So that's something that we're actually looking to occur through future events, and we will see those happen through the appointed times. So when he came the first time, again, he came to pay the price, to shed his blood for the remission of sins, to wash us clean, and so that we will not have to pay the penalty of breaking that covenant ourselves. And we see the whole process of that, paying that price through the Passover meal, where he was actually renewing the covenant with 12 disciples who represented all 12 tribes of Israel, both houses. Now, this was at Passover, no question. I know there's some people that are teaching that it happened before Passover because they want him to die when all the lambs are being slaughtered, but they're missing the whole point, that he came as the Lamb of Elohim, but you need the lamb at the Passover Seder. He was the lamb at this Passover Seder. We read about it in Luke 22 when it talks about the day when the Passover must be killed, and starting at verse 8 he says, "And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." So Luke is telling us it's the day when the Passover lambs were killed, and Yeshua is telling him to go get a place for us that we may eat. And they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare?" And he said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters." And this is all very interesting because we can discern that he probably was an Essene going into the Essene quarter. I've taken my tour groups there where we actually have, they've discovered the Essene gate buried probably, 20 feet below the surface of modern-day Jerusalem. So we can actually see the gate that probably this man carrying the water, because we know that in the Essene community, men carried water, where typically in Middle Eastern communities, it was the women that carried the water. So you can kind of put pieces of this puzzle together, and we probably saw the gate that this man went through, and then the disciples followed him through, and probably Yeshua went through that gate also when they later went through the Passover meal and the process. And in verse 11, there's to say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? 13, so they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come for the Passover, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them, with fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of Elohim. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves, for I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Elohim comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise he took the cup after supper, saying, this is the cup of the renewed covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. So he's symbolizing that his body is the unleavened bread of that Passover meal, the matzah, and that he's renewing the covenant through his blood, and that would later happen the following day, which is still Passover day, because we know that days actually begin in the evening. So this would have been day 14. Right after sundown, they would have been partaking in this Passover meal. He renews the covenant and then later dies on Passover day. So this absolutely was a Passover meal. There's no mention of any lamb intentionally, because Yeshua was representing the Lamb of Elohim at this meal. So it's all about renewal with Yisrael. The 12 disciples, again, they were representing the 12 tribes. And interestingly, Judas betrayed Yeshua, and it was Judah that specifically rejected him at that time and continues to reject him predominantly even to this day. And that's why the language of the renewed covenant treats the house of Judah and the house of Israel separately. See, because Yeshua was fulfilling the promise of the renewed covenant given by Jeremiah, and we read about that in Jeremiah 31 through 36. It says, behold, the days are coming, says Yahuwah, when I will make a renewed covenant. Again, a lot of Bibles read new, but it's the Chodesh. It's that same root as the renewed moon, that cycle. He's not making a brand new covenant. He's renewing the covenant with the house of Yisrael and the house of Yehudah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says Yahuwah. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Yisrael after those days, says Yahuwah. I will put my Torah in their minds and write it on their hearts, and I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. No more shall each man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know Yahuwah, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says Yahuwah. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Thus says Yahuwah, who gives the sun for light by day, the ordinance of the moon, and the stars for light by night, who disturbs the sea and its waves roar. Yahuwah of hosts is his name. If these ordinances depart from before me, says Yahuwah, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. This is a great promise. And notice the distinction between the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah. And also notice the connection with the ordinance of time. All right. Well, Genesis 1:14 only mentions the two great lights, the greater light and the lesser light. This passage specifically identifies the sun as Shemesh, we read in Hebrew, and the moon, Yerech, we read in Hebrew. So, some people try to say that those lights on the fourth day weren't actually the sun and the moon. Well, he's clearly saying that they are in this text. And these ordinances are there for time and the appointed times so that Israel can meet with Yahuwah. And it all comes back to the covenant. And you notice what he's saying here. He's not saying he's going to create some new covenant with the Christian religion. Not at all. He's renewing the covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah. And he, again, it's all about the Torah too. He's specifically saying it's not going to be like the other covenant where I wrote the Torah on tablets of stone. I'm going to renew it, but this time it's going to be different because I'm going to put it on their hearts and their minds. And so, but it's still the Torah. And so many Christians really, really misunderstand the whole renewed covenant process, and that's kind of why I'm emphasizing at this point, because when we're steeped in Christianity, we're taught that the law is done away with, but and that Jesus came and started a new covenant. Well, you should ask your Christian friends, well, where is this new covenant? Because a covenant has terms, and where do I find the terms of this new covenant? And most will not be able to tell you, but Jeremiah 31 is where the terms of the renewed covenant is. And the parties to this renewed covenant are Yahweh and the house of Yisrael and the house of Yehudah. So you've got to, if you want to be in this covenant, you've got to be in that relationship somehow. And Yeshua is the one that actually helps us to get into that relationship through the work that he accomplished. So, and again, but it involves the Torah. And you better darn well believe that you need to have the Torah written in your hearts and your minds, and you need to be obeying the Torah if you want to be in this renewed covenant. There is no other covenant, and so that's an important distinction to understand. So the process of restoring mankind back to Eden involves this covenant that's renewed and refined through time. And again, this is what many Christians completely fail to understand regarding the covenant renewed by the Messiah. He's renewing the covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah. He's not making a brand new covenant with the Christian church. And we see this clearly from the text and also by the fact that in Hebrew we read Brit Hadashah. Brit is covenant, as we talked about before with Bereshit. You've got the Brit with the Esh, the fire in the middle. So Brit is covenant, and Hadashah is renewed, the renewed. So you've got that Hodesh aspect to it. So you've got the Hodesh, Hadashah, renewed, and then Brit, covenant. Now after renewing the covenant at the Passover meal, Yeshua then later died on Passover day according to the terms of the covenant that he made with Abram. He was then resurrected and taken up as described in Revelation 12:5. Again, the Revelation tells us about his birth, and then later on in 12:5 it says, and she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to Elohim and his throne. And so Yeshua, after being born, lived, died, resurrected, and was caught up. And then Revelation further on tells us about his second coming, his return. He didn't stay because the punishment period for the house of Israel had not been completed. And that's something we're going to talk about in a future episode. But the house of Israel was punished before the house of Yehudah. They were taken by the Assyrians, and their sins were so dramatic that their punishment period was multiplied 7 times. And we'll talk about that in the future when we talk about Yisrael, because we need to understand all of Yisrael was not in a condition to come out of their punishment and actually be restored at that time that Yeshua was first on the earth. So he's waiting for that punishment period to be completed upon the house of Yisrael until he returns, and then he can rightfully restore both houses. So he ascended, and then he sent his spirit on Shavuot, often called Pentecost. Now, recall that this was the same time which was associated with the giving of the Torah as the terms of the wedding covenant. When Israel left Egypt and went to Mount Sinai, that was Shavuot, when Elohim spoke the 10 words from the mountain, and now we see Yeshua actually sending the Spirit on that same appointed time. So he was equipping the bride. The Spirit was sent according to the renewed covenant so that the Torah, again, could be in our hearts and in our minds. And the Spirit is there to help us to obey. So again, it all gets back to the covenant and the Torah being the instructions and the guidance, the yoke of the covenant. So now we look forward to returning to a right relationship, the one anticipated before the golden calf event at Sinai. Now remember again that Sinai, it was a wedding ceremony. But that covenant process was disrupted and it was broken. But there was a renewal at Sinai, as we discussed. The renewal occurred through Moses. He broke the first set of tablets. But we have a pattern of renewal through Moses, as he was then instructed to carve out a second set of tablets, which then he had to carry up the mountain. And Yah once again wrote the terms of the covenant on those tablets. So the first tablets were provided by Yah, but Moshe broke those because Yisrael broke that covenant. But Yah allowed a renewal through a man, and that man would cut those tablets and bring them and present them to Yah, and then Yah would write the terms of the covenant on those second set of tablets. So that's a pattern, again, of renewal that we would see occur in the future through Messiah. And we read in Deuteronomy 18, beginning at 15, Yahweh, your Elohim, will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of Yahweh your Elohim in Horeb, in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Yahweh my Elohim, nor let me see this great fire any more, lest I die. And Yahweh said to me, what they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So what we're reading here is that the people did not want to hear directly from Yahweh, so Yah chose Moshe, and they're going to send another to speak his words, and that's exactly what we see happening. Moses always represents the Torah, and so when we're looking for the Messiah, when we're looking for this prophet, we should look for one teaching the Torah, just as Moses spoke the Torah, and that's why we're supposed to listen to him. And Yeshua absolutely came teaching the Torah. He specifically said he didn't come to destroy it, but to fulfill the Torah and the prophets, and that's exactly what he did. If you actually read his teachings and read the words that he spoke, he was instructing people about the Torah. He was showing them the error of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he was setting them on the right path, the straight path of the Torah. He was, in fact, the Torah in the flesh, the Word in the flesh, and he renewed the covenant, which was all about the Torah, and was obeying the Torah. And he empowered his followers to obey by sending the Spirit. So we await a future fulfillment of the appointed times. We see these appointed times through the cycle of times being fulfilled and refreshed and renewed. And that's what people need to understand. The whole idea of renewal is refreshing. We talked about the beginning of the year, beginning in the month of the Aviv, the month of the refreshing, the renewal. And again, that's why the appointed times begin in that month one, the month of the refreshing. It's a reminder that this whole process is about cycles. And of course, we talked about the Hebrew way of thinking, the Eastern way of thinking, and thinking in cyclical thought and living cyclically, and that's what the appointed times are all about. Now, Yeshua, after his resurrection and providing the Spirit, later appeared to his disciple John on the island of Patmos. And that revelation is described in the text known as the Revelation. The book of Revelation describes the plagues upon the world that will result in the deliverance of the bride of the Messiah. And of course, we take these patterns from the past, and we're actually seeing fulfillments of these patterns in the future through the cycle of the appointed times. And this will be on a much greater scale than what happened in Egypt, and it'll be fulfilling the pattern of the previous deliverance from Egypt. And we actually read about this as prophesied by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 16:14-15. He says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, that it shall no more be said, Yahweh lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but Yahweh lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them. For I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers." So again, the Exodus from Egypt was an incredible event, and I don't think we've seen anything like that since, but we should expect something greater in the future where people won't even be talking about that deliverance from Egypt anymore, and the parting of the Red Sea and the deliverance through the waters. Again, that going through the waters, that's a very Hebrew thing. Passing through, that's actually what Hebrew means. We pass through. Whether it's the blood or the water, that's the mark of a Hebrew. And so we're looking forward to a greater fulfillment even in the future. And when we view this future deliverance in the context of the Exodus from Egypt, we see the deliverance occurring through the grain harvest. Now, it's significant to point out that it's believed that the plagues upon Egypt occurred over a period of about 6 months prior to the Passover. And if that's true, the judgments rendered upon Egypt likely began around the time of day 10 of month 7, the year prior, on or around Yom Kippur. And that makes perfect sense when we understand what these appointed times are all about. So it's something to remember when we consider a future fulfillment of these patterns. And I'm actually taping this episode as we're approaching Yom Kippur. We're looking to that date, and of course an interesting note is, and I'll make a comment because again we had that September 23rd 2017 sign that everybody was interested in, and everybody thought that was going to be a rapture or a Messiah returning or the beginning of a Jubilee. And I'm only mentioning this just because people had many expectations, but a Jubilee doesn't begin on Yom Teruah. It doesn't begin when we typically mark the beginning of a new year on day 1 of month 1 or Rosh Hashanah, day 1 of month 7. Actually, a Jubilee year begins on Yom Kippur, day 10 of month 7. So if you're looking for the beginning of a Jubilee, you need to be looking at Yom Kippur. And we read about that in Leviticus 25, starting at 8. It talks about blowing the Yovel, the Jubilee shofar, on day 10 of month 7, Yom Kippur. So that's just a side note, but Yom Kippur is a very, very important appointed time. A lot of powerful things happen on that date, and of course the beginning of the Jubilee occurs on that date. Now back to the book of Revelation, which is actually describing what happened in Egypt, but it's occurring on a global scale here, when Yah is looking at punishing the nations of the planet, not just Egypt. And while those nations are being punished, we're expecting to see a deliverance of his bride, of his redeemed people. And it's describing a simultaneously judgment and a harvesting of the earth. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, the appointed times are specifically connected with the harvest cycles of the covenant land. And it's describing a renewal process. And this is why the calendar, again, begins in the month of the Aviv, the month of the springing forth, the month of the renewal. Through the patterns of the appointed times and renewal through the cycles of time, we can see the plan of Yahweh leading to the completion as they flow through the ages to get us back to the garden, back to the renewed Jerusalem. And that's what the renewed Jerusalem represents, is the garden. So from the beginning to the end, we're seeing a whole restoration process. And remember that the garden involves dwelling in the presence of Elohim and the provision of food. The food in the garden was the fruit trees. Only after being expelled from the garden did man have to work the ground. We read about that in Genesis 3:23. It says, "Therefore Yahweh Elohim sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken." So from that point on, we see two distinct crops that are represented by two very distinct times in the appointed, the Moedim season. We see the grain harvest flowing through to the fruit harvest. Now these are very different. One involves annual toiling. You have to, for the grain, it's every year you have to till the land, you have to plant, and then you have to Then you have to harvest the crops, and then once you've harvested those crops, you have to thresh and winnow and store and separate. And there's a lot of work with the grain harvest, and it's very different from the fruit harvest, which we see towards the end of the cycle of the appointed times. Remember, the appointed times don't go through 12 months or 13 months, whatever the year has. They are the first 7 months of the year. So they begin with the grain harvest, and then they end in the 7th month with the culmination of the fruit harvest. So, of course, the fruits are, the pomegranates and the olives and the grapes. And so, these are things that don't have to be replanted every year. We go to the vines and we cut the clusters of grapes. We go to the trees and we cut the fruit. And so very different harvest seasons, very different emphasis in these two different appointed times. They begin with the grain and with the fruit. Now, because of the sin in the garden, mankind must now toil every year for the grain to make the bread that sustains him. And Yahweh showed that he's willing to free us from that toiling when he provides us with bread from heaven, manna. And that's why Messiah was born in Bethlehem, house of bread. And that's why the grain harvest begins during the Passover. And during the Passover, we have the Reshit offering. Remember, Bereshit means in beginning, Bereshit. Well, in Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have the Reshit offering, which that means the very first offering. And we read about that in Leviticus 23:9. It says, "And Yahuwah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf, an omer of the first fruits of your harvest." That first fruits is Reshit of your harvest to the priest. Et Omer Reshit is what we read here, and we have that Aleph Ta connected with the Omer and the Reshit. So Yeshua is the first offering, and we see that through the pattern. And he's the barley offering, the first grain that is harvested. That begins the grain harvest. And the barley is the lowly, the servant type grain. It's not the best, which is the wheat. So Yeshua comes in humility the first time. He's that first offering. And then he can gather in his wheat. And of course, he talked about the wheat harvest being his harvest, and we actually read about that in Matthew 3:12, when John said his winnowing fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clean out his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. And of course, that's why Yeshua gave the parables of the wheat and the tares, because he's talking about gathering his wheat, and the tares he's going to burn, just like John said. And that's why he gave disciples, so we could understand and put these things together. His covenant people are the wheat harvest, and Messiah will reap his people during a future wheat harvest that we read about in Revelation 14 through 16. It says, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on a cloud, Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on a cloud thrusted his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped." And of course, Yeshua said he'd be coming in the clouds. He told us he would be coming in the clouds. So here we're identifying this one reaping the harvest of the earth as Messiah reaping his wheat harvest. It's later when the rest of the earth is harvested during the grape harvest leading up to the 7th month. And we read about that in Revelation 14:17 through 20. It says that another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, who had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of Elohim. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. So this process leads us through the cycle of the appointed times. that will continue to and through the millennial kingdom. In fact, even after this harvesting, when Messiah harvests the wheat harvest, and then the other angel harvests the fruit and puts them in the winepress of the wrath of Elohim, we anticipate the millennial kingdom beginning after that event. And Zechariah actually describes a future time when Messiah rules over the earth. And we read about this in Zechariah 14:8-9. It says, "And in that day it shall be the living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur. And Yahweh shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be, Yahweh is one, his name is one, Echad." So, and this is why now Zechariah emphasizes Sukkot during this period of time, which is also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. It occurs in the 7th month, as we talked about in a prior episode. Zechariah 14:16 says, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles," Sukkot. So again, this is a 7-day feast that does not completely get fulfilled until the end of the 1,000-year millennial reign, that Sabbath reign of the Messiah. It's very important to understand that the appointed times are not completely fulfilled until the end of time as we know it. I know there's some people out there that are teaching that, oh, Yeshua came and he fulfilled the spring feast, and now we're waiting for him to fulfill the fall feast. But you have to remember that that's not really completely correct. He was born on Yom Teruah, so that was a partial fulfillment of the appointed time of day 1 of month 7. So he came on an appointed time in month 7. It was a partial fulfillment, but there will be a future fulfillment. In fact, a lot of people look to that date as a date for him to return on. So again, you can't say that he completely fulfilled the spring feast and we're waiting for him to fulfill the fall feast, because there's overlap and there's renewals and there's multiple fulfillments of these feasts. There's more to come for all of them, and only when the millennial reign is concluded are the appointed times of the 7th month completely fulfilled, and that's when the renewed Jerusalem ultimately sets down on this planet. And we read about that in Revelation 21:2. It says, "Then I, John, saw the set-apart city, renewed Jerusalem, come down out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." At that final Sukkot, we end on the 7th day, Hoshana Rabbah, which then progresses to the 8th day, the final appointed time in the entire cycle, Shemini Atzeret. Again, this 8th day actually occurs on day 22 of month 7. And the appointed times of month 7, again, begin on day 1, Aleph.
And they continue to day 22, the Ta.
So the focus of the 7th month is clearly on the Messiah. Those 7th month appointed times begin at the Aleph and they end at the Ta, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. So the focus then shifts from 7 to 8. And of course, this is the fulfillment of the covenant of circumcision, that 8th day covenant. And it's the renewal of the covenant by Messiah. 8 means new beginnings. Again, this is a complete renewal when we read about the renewed heavens and the renewed earth. So when the bride and her husband can finally consummate the marriage on that renewed earth. And these patterns of fulfillment and cycles of renewal are very Hebrew. And that's how the Elohim of the Hebrews helps us to learn his ways and to walk his path. And it's critical that we learn to think, walk, and live like an Easterner so that we can fully understand the covenant renewed by the Messiah, that Hebrew Messiah. And we already mentioned that covenant is made with Yisrael. And in order to be in that covenant, you must be part of the assembly of Yisrael. And that will be the subject of our next episode when we talk further about the identity of Yisrael. Until then, my name is Todd Bennett. Shalom.